I got married last month, so my wife wanted to study the Song of Solomon together. A lot of Christians feel weird about this book. It's centered on romance, sex, intimacy, and marriage. It doesn't have any obvious theological content, so it doesn't really get taught in a lot of churches, and a lot of people end up wondering why it's there. To make matters worse, a lot of interpreters see it allegorically. Christians notice that the two main male roles are shepherd and king, so they relate this to a picture of people like David and Christ. And then they see this book as a picture of Christ and the church, so it becomes a sort of appendix to the story of how he pours his life out for her, how he leads her, and how he protects her, that's focused on how he finds delight in her. This is really powerful, but a lot of young people are frustrated with the idea of reading a text allegorically, so this just wafts over their heads. And a lot of churches don't want to deal with the complexity of that. One of my Orthodox Jewish friends told me that they also read it allegorically. They think of the woman as being the virtuous woman from Proverbs, Solomon's most famous book. Proverbs presents wisdom itself as a woman who goes around traveling everywhere and teaching people, and it uses the metaphor of courtship to explain how we should relate to her. Thus, for a lot of Orthodox Jewish readers, it's about the individual courting wisdom. Both of these readings are great, and I would advise everyone to read the book in both of these ways. But they have their roots in the plainest reading of the text there is, which is a sequence of scenes where we see a man and a woman in various stages of romance. Some people argue that these scenes are out of order, and the writer is doing something interesting by telling this story with flashbacks and codas. Other people are going to argue that in the different scenes we're seeing different couples, and thus in the book we're seeing something like the pattern or essence of romance. The most common view I'm used to is it's about a woman who's in love with a shepherd. The king sees her and falls in love with her, and she has to make the choice between love and life in a palace with great riches. Or in some way, the two figures are just one man and one woman interwoven in all of these different environments. I'm not going to push the text in any of these directions for now, even though I think they can give valuable insights. We will discuss these all next week, but for now it's sufficient to think about the text and the simplest, most obvious reading of it, that it's about love, plain and simple. Just whilst we're talking through the book in very general terms, if you read it, you'll notice it's full of garden, or more specifically, Garden of Eden imagery. And this takes us back to Genesis. But interestingly, it also takes it back to Solomon's other great work, his temple in the city of Jerusalem, where he had all of the pillars carved to look like trees, and lots of carvings of trees and fruit and nature images around the temple. This book begins by telling the reader it's written by Solomon, this guy here in this image. Modern critics are going to argue that it's from a later period, because they always argue that everything in the Bible is from a later period. But the book presents itself as being by Solomon. So even if you're tied to the idea it's written hundreds of years later, you have to see it in that context and ask what the author is doing by presenting this as if it was by Solomon. As soon as you know it's by Solomon, you're hit by the drama that's happening around the book. Solomon has 700 wives and 300 concubines. There's this famous Jewish idea that when Solomon would copy out the Torah, he would change the verse in Deuteronomy that says, the king must not take many wives, so that it would say, the king must take many wives. But this book doesn't present the ideal marriage as when you have 999 women and you finally find that 1,000th one. It presents the romantic ideal as one-on-one, of mutual belonging. The woman says, my beloved is mine and I am his. Not, my beloved is 1/1000th mine and I am his. And then in every scene after that, we see this one-on-one romance being heightened. For example, the woman says, your name is like honey on the lips. No wonder the maidens love you. What does this tell us? That the male character could have any of these other maidens, but he chooses this one singular woman Again, we see the daughters of Jerusalem, these maidens, saying to the woman, "Who is your beloved? Why do you look for him? Why is he so much better than all of the other men?" And the woman, the bride-to-be, she gives this epic speech about her beloved's attributes. But the center of that speech is she doesn't choose any of these other men. She chooses him. They are each other's. They are chosen by each other. They are going to be together in this co-ownership or co-choosing of marriage. So we have to ask the question, why would a guy with 700 wives and 300 concubines write a book about monogamy being the highest form of romance? To answer that, we have to look elsewhere in the Bible. As soon as we look at Solomon's life, we see that it's framed by the problems that come from polygamy. Astute Bible readers will notice what's going on in this picture already, but just to build that out for everyone else, in the left-hand side of this picture, we see King David. This is, maybe the greatest king of Israel. So he's anointed by Samuel to reign, whilst King Saul is still reigning. And although that David is friends with Saul, from then on, Saul decides to try and kill David over and over again. David has every opportunity to start a civil war or revolution, but doesn't. Even when he has the opportunity to kill Saul in his sleep, he doesn't. The ability to turn the other cheek is why David plays such a huge role in the Old Testament, because he is in this wonderful way. He's an image of Christ. Jesus has many ancestors, but we would consistently call him the Son of David. And that's because on the way to Jesus reigning, he goes through a heightened version of these trials.
Jesus has been anointed at his baptism by God as Messiah, the King of the world, and he's serving everyone around him, being long-suffering with them. But the rulers are trying to kill him, and eventually they are going to kill him. And when he's dying, he is going to even quote that psalm that David wrote about his unjust persecution that begins, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Of course, that's much more extreme than what happens with David. So David gets persecuted, he gets nearly killed many, many times. He eventually becomes king. But Christ is actually going to go through an actual literal death and a resurrection before he reigns in kingdom glory. Because of this profound goodness that David shows, with its amazing way in which he is an image of Christ, there's a peaceful transition of power. There's no civil war, no revolution, no mass murders of this group or that group. The wealth of the nation isn't spilled out to pay for mercenaries, and the common people of Israel get to continue their lives without having them soaked into some pointless conflict.
But whilst David does all of this good, as this picture tells us, his family life is genuinely messy. He had a bad relationship with his first wife, the daughter of King Saul. And over the course of his life, he marries 8 different women. In the picture, we see David and Solomon's mum. David falls in love with a married woman called Bathsheba. He sleeps with her, and he works really hard to try and cover it up. But every one of his plans and schemes failed. So he has her husband killed and marries Bathsheba.
Just think of that. This man who spent the majority of his young life trying to avoid conflict with Paul, trying to avoid needless deaths, has now become a murderer because he wanted to hide the fact that he had slept with this other man's wife.
This is a really powerful picture of sin. It takes a hold of good people with weaknesses and pulls them through things that they choose into things that they could never imagine. But more than that, his father's misdeeds, this sad story with Bathsheba, echoes through into the next generation. If you break rules, it's incredibly hard to raise your children to keep them, especially if your time is being split between 8 different women and their children. So David's son Amnon does something infinitely worse. David has no idea how to respond. So his other son Absalom takes revenge and kills Amnon. Sons of the king killing each other is a recipe for civil war. And soon we see that coming to fruition. Absalom now is not just killing his brother, but he is leading a revolution against his father. In the end, the revolution fails and he dies horribly. But we have to see this through the eyes of their little brother Solomon. So Solomon is, probably very young at this time. Maybe he's 5 or 10, and he's watching not some strangers, but his brothers and sisters die and kill each other. Solomon is probably dramatically hurt by this. Probably he feels lost. Probably it makes him question so much of what he thought about the world. Maybe in part, what we're seeing in the Song of Solomon is that instead of having his attention divided between 1,000 different women, Solomon is pining for the attention of one father. We know that for Solomon, one of his big focuses was on the opening chapters of Genesis, the Garden of Eden imagery throughout this book, and the Garden of Eden imagery throughout the temple that he built. Perhaps Solomon is reading the same Torah that people joke about him copying wrong, and seeing in Genesis 1 the way that God made the first family in contrast to the broken family he grew up in. And he's praying. And God's inspiration for this book comes in response to the question he's asking.
What ends up on the page is amazing, and it really connects well with the themes from his other writings. In Proverbs, perhaps the central idea is that the wisest kingdom isn't the kingdom with the wisest king, but a kingdom where everyone is pursuing wisdom. Song of Songs doesn't portray the solution to the brutal experience of the tragedies that go along with polygamy as the king finding his 1,000th wife, but the bride choosing her man above all the other men, and the man choosing his bride above all the other women. Again, so if your assumption is that this book is being written hundreds of years later and put in Solomon's mouth or as a historical fiction featuring it, you have to notice this connection with Proverbs. What Proverbs does by democratizing wisdom, telling everyone to find it, Song of Songs seems to be doing for commitment and love, and then showing these as the foundational way out of these tragedies. If we take this conceptual framework, where we notice that the themes of Song of Solomon seem to answer all of the problems in Israel's history and Solomon's life, by redirecting the reader to this one-on-one garden romance that we see at the start of Genesis, it doesn't just connect the book with Proverbs, it also connects the book to Solomon's temple. In the temple, we see all kinds of garden imagery in the way things are carved. With the design of the building, Solomon seems to be saying, despite all the history and the tragedy that begins with the fall, you can still have something like this Garden of Eden experience and come close to God. In the Song of Songs, your romance, your family can be just as much in the hands of God as Adam and Eve were. For some people, the idea that doing romance right in one generation could have an impact on the next generation is a foreign idea. So it's useful to link this to some modern studies. The Bible portrays Solomon as supernaturally wise, so it's really interesting to see that the thinking that the book comes out of doesn't just connect it with the temple and Proverbs, but to modern sociology and anthropology. Probably the most famous anthropologist discussing this is J.D. Unwin, who writes the book Sex and Culture.
In it, he examines the data from 86 human societies and finds exactly what we were discussing here, but on a civilizational level. When societies have deep commitments around romance, especially monogamy, they flourish. When one generation renounces these elements of romance, they dwindle. In general, it takes 3 generations without these commitments, and societies are generally overtaken and conquered by their neighbors, or otherwise destroyed. Unwin looks for an explanation. All of the energy that goes into inventing things, building things, raising children, goes into chasing the next partner. So these societies decay. And this is fascinating because in Unwin's work, we're finding an anthropologist explaining in concrete, evidential terms exactly all the spiritual topics we're discussing here. Since the time of Unwin, this has only been heightened more. We've seen the decline of fatherhood in Western civilization. We've seen the effects of fatherlessness on children. So just look at this. If you're raised without a father, you're 4 times more likely to end up in poverty. You're more likely to have behavioral problems. You're 2 times more likely to die as an infant. You're more likely to go to prison. You're more likely to commit crime. You're 7 times more likely to become pregnant as a teen. You're more likely to face abuse and neglect, more likely to get involved with drugs and alcohol, double the chance of suffering from obesity, and double the chance of dropping out of high school. This is world changing and tells us exactly what we've been saying, that the love between a man and a woman can change the world, if only for the next generation. But if the message of the book is so simple, and so much can be got out of the plain reading of the Song of Solomon, why have Christians and Jews spent literally thousands of years writing all these commentaries that see it allegorically? To answer that, we need to start with the verses that perhaps inspired the book. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, to rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, and over all the earth itself, and every creature that crawls upon it." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the air, and every creature that crawls upon the earth." What do we see? This text tells us that individuals are made in the image of God, but that also marriage relationships are. In this verse, we show you a very short version of what we're going to see in Genesis chapters 2, 3, and maybe chapter 4. God creates man and draws woman out of him. Man is in the image of God. Woman is in the image of God. And somehow the two of them are in the image of the Trinity. How can 2 people be in the image of 3? Well, this makes sense when you realize that we're designed to both be filled with God's Holy Spirit. What does that mean? That our love and commitment to each other in the marriage are made in the image of God's love and commitment within the Trinity and to us as shown on the cross. All of the ways that we can love each other and connect to each other in love are in some ways images of the love between the Trinity. Understanding this makes sense of why the apostle writes, "God is love," in a book where he's exhorting people to love each other. Understanding how God relates to himself calls us via Genesis 1 to see his image in us and to want to express his image through love and commitment to our spouses in the world. God created you to relate to others with the same love that fills the Trinity, and he wants you to relate to him with that same love too. As a result, when you read the Song of Solomon, it's like zooming in on this tiny piece of a huge tessellating map. As you understand this book better, you're going to understand how you are called to relate to your spouse if you have one. You're going to understand the romance that God is preparing you for if you're single. But for free, you're also going to get this wonderful picture of how you are to court and romance wisdom and how Christ loves his church. Because all these relationships, all these kinds of love are echoes of the same love within the Trinity. This sort of is the nature of God's grace. God gives us these indescribably brilliant gifts, and the more we look at him, the more we see them in relation to him, the better they become. In conclusion, literal and spiritual readings of this book don't compete. In the same way that a building and its foundation are not competing for a space, the spiritual reading is deeply connected to and founded on the literal reading. And because love is a spiritual matter, the literal reading naturally reaches its climax in the spiritual. Every aspect of love we see in this book is good because it is in the image of God. So as this book is filled with the goodness of human relationships, we can learn not just about human relationships, but about God and how he relates to us. This isn't a hermeneutic that I've invented to reconcile the readings of this book. It's one that the Bible presents and uses again and again. Jesus' parables revolve around human relationships. In nearly all of them, he is using the idea that by understanding what a good person would do, for example, the father of the prodigal son or the owner of a vineyard, we can get a tiny window into how God behaves in his goodness. This is because goodness isn't just an arbitrary set of rules that God made up, a la Euphorio's dilemma. Goodness is God's character and nature. And when people do good things, they are the things that they're created to do, they're broadcasting his image. Beyond the parables, if you read Hosea, you're going to see this, how the story of Gomer the prostitute and the prophet's love for her and goodness towards her helps us understand God's love and goodness towards humanity, Israel, and the church as well as us in all of our failings. You could think of the Song of Songs and the book of Hosea in some sense being mirrors to each other, or echoes of each other, or actually bookends to this wonderful pattern that you see throughout the prophets. So if you read the prophets, you're going to again and again and again and again see the idea of God and Israel as being represented by a marriage or being represented by a family. But more than that, you see it in the New Testament. So if you read the book of Galatians, you're going to see that Paul uses the story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar to help us understand how God works even in the face of our unbelief, and how that actually shapes history. So I would advise you, as you dive into the Song of Solomon, to read it literally and to listen to those preachers who make sense of it in terms of a book on marriage, but at the same time not to discount the idea that because of the symmetries of God's goodness and grace, that it can also be a window into God's nature and his delight in the church and in you, or all the spiritual things that all the allegorical commentaries talk about. Hallelujah. If you want to request God's grace on any aspect of your life, if you're touched by these stories of Solomon, David, Saul, please feel free to use the comment section. If you're comfortable praying for others, I'd like you to use the end of the video just to read through the comments, praying for people and messaging and connecting with them. I recommend that you read the book yourself with a pen and paper so that you can write down the things that God is highlighting to you as you read it. I'm going to put this in a playlist with the book playing straight after it so that you don't need to press any buttons. It'll take 20 minutes or 30 minutes if you're pausing a lot and writing a lot of notes. Next week, I'm going to upload a sequel to this video where we talk about the narrative of the book. If it's already up, I strongly recommend that you don't watch it yet, but you listen to the audio and you read and make notes first. One of the things that I'm very concerned with is that the Bible is this amazing landscape that God is calling us to explore, not just as churches, not just as groups, not just as Bible study groups, but as individuals. If you can, go through the book slowly, prayerfully, write notes, and if you want to discuss your ideas, post them underneath this video. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the wisdom that God deposits in your heart, the way that quoting God's divine wisdom is going to be fulfilled in your life. Hopefully see you all soon.